Before computers, before flight simulators, before virtual reality, one machine trained more pilots than any device in history. It wasn't a plane or even airborne. It was a box, blue, wooden, and bolted to the floor. And inside it, a generation learned how to survive the sky before ever touching it. The year was 1943. The U.S. Army Air Corps hangar near San Antonio groaned with wind and the echo of engines warming for takeoff. But in the far corner, away from the sleek metal and open doors, sat something strange. Small, round, half cockpit, half coffin. A young cadet climbed inside, the lid closing over him with a hollow thud. The machine hissed to life, its canvas skin fluttering as hidden bellows filled with air. He was sealed inside a world that wasn't flying, but felt like it. A voice broke through the static of a loudspeaker. "Cadet Miller, you're entering a storm bank. Trust your instruments." Inside the capsule there was no horizon, no wind, no sky. Only the hum of pumps and the twitch of needles on the panel. The cadet's hands gripped the stick, his breath shallow. The machine tilted slightly, the floor shifting beneath his boots. He corrected instinctively, unaware that his body was learning faster than his mind. Outside, the instructor stood beside a plotting table, tracing the cadet's invisible flight path across a paper map. Every turn, every dive, every mistake was recorded through a delicate network of levers and ink pens connected to the machine's base. The system was called the Link Trainer, and it was rewriting aviation's most dangerous equation: training without death. In those days, learning to fly meant gambling with gravity. Hundreds of cadets had already died in peacetime training, lost in fog, night, or vertigo. The Link changed that. It created danger without consequence, fear without finality. For the first time, a pilot could crash and walk away. Yet for all its genius, the machine felt ghostly. The bellows wheezed like lungs. The cockpit swayed as if haunted by invisible winds. The cadet's face, half lit by the faint glow of instruments, carried a strange calm. The look of someone flying through an imagination made mechanical. Outside the hangar, real planes clawed into the air, their exhaust mixing with morning fog. But the war's truest battle, the one that would decide who lived long enough to reach those skies, was happening in silence, inside a plywood shell built by a piano maker's son. By the time the session ended, the cadet emerged sweating, dazed and smiling faintly. He hadn't moved an inch from the ground, but he'd flown 100 miles in his mind. What he didn't know was that he was one of a million. Across the world, pilots from every allied nation would soon climb into these blue boxes, learning to trust instruments, defeat vertigo, and survive the clouds, all without ever leaving the floor. Long before the war, before the roar of engines filled the skies, a young man in upstate New York was listening, not to aircraft but to organs. Edwin Link Jr. grew up in the hum of his father's piano and organ factory, surrounded by bellows, pipes, and polished wood that breathed when played. While other boys chased the dream of flight through clouds, Link chased it through machinery. He believed flight could be taught the same way music was, by rhythm, repetition, and feel. He spent his evenings alone in the workshop, long after the factory lights dimmed. The smell of varnish and glue hung in the air. By lantern light he dismantled bellows and repurposed vacuum pumps, fitting them into a wooden frame shaped like a cockpit. It was absurd. A flight simulator made from the lungs of a church organ. But to Link it made perfect sense. If air could make sound, it could make movement. His friends laughed. Local pilots dismissed him outright. "You can't learn to fly without flying," they told him. Even his father thought the idea was foolish, but Link couldn't let it go. In those years, flying was deadly. Planes stalled without warning. Instruments failed. Novice pilots had no way to train for what they couldn't see. Every week, another newspaper headline carried the same phrase: training accident. He'd seen one himself. A friend fresh from lessons had vanished into fog and never come back. When they found the wreckage, the compass was intact, but the man wasn't. Link swore there had to be a safer way to teach. The question that haunted him was simple. What if a pilot could crash 100 times and walk away every time? His first pilot trainer was crude, a coffin-sized box mounted on a motion base powered by compressed air. The pedals tilted the cabin, the stick rolled it, and a small motor created turbulence. Inside, the pilot sat blind, guided only by instruments, not exactly like flying through clouds. Outside, an instructor tracked the flight path through inked pens on a plotting board. It was both mechanical and magical, a storm in miniature controlled by bellows and imagination. Link took his creation on the road, hauling it from airfield to airfield in the back of a truck. He gave free demonstrations, inviting pilots to climb in and test it. Most walked away amused. Some were offended. One instructor laughed so hard he nearly fell over. "You expect us to teach flying in a box?" he scoffed. Link packed up his trainer, heart pounding with humiliation, and moved on to the next town. Months passed. No one bought it. No schools. No investors. He went bankrupt twice. His wife, Marion, quietly pawned jewelry to keep his workshop alive. Yet every night he returned to the same machine, tightening valves, smoothing wood, listening to the rhythm of its breathing. The world saw failure. Link saw refinement. Then in 1934, fate caught up with need. A U.S. Army Air Corps training mission ended in disaster. Cadets lost in fog. Their planes scattered across the countryside. The investigation found the same problem Link had warned about. Pilots were not being trained to fly by instruments. They had learned to trust their eyes and died for it. Within weeks, the Army called him. "We hear you've built something," the officer said over the phone. Link looked at the silent box beside him, its paint chipped, its bellows resting like lungs after exertion. "Yes," he replied softly, "something that teaches men to live before they fly." For the first time, someone was finally listening. By 1934, the golden age of flight was bleeding at the edges. Newspapers still printed heroic photographs of smiling young aviators standing beside their biplanes, goggles gleaming, jackets crisp. But what the headlines didn't show were the wrecks scattered across the fields. Twisted wings, torn fabric, bodies covered with tarps. Behind every photograph of a daring pilot was a ledger of names struck through in red ink. Civilian flight schools were expanding faster than they could teach. Airfields once filled with excitement now carried the sour smell of gasoline and burnt oil. Pilots learned how to climb and dive, how to stall and recover, but not how to survive the sky when the ground disappeared. Fog, darkness, and weather killed more cadets than combat ever would. For every 100 trained, 10 never returned. The U.S. Army Air Corps was losing faith in its own methods. Their doctrine was outdated. Flight by sight, not by instrument. Yet the new generation of aircraft flew faster, higher and farther, often beyond the horizon of human instinct. Spatial disorientation was invisible, lethal, and merciless. Pilots trusted their senses until their senses betrayed them. Instructors watched helplessly as trainees climbed into clouds and never came back. Captain Harold Simmons, a training officer in Ohio, later recalled, "We'd send them up in perfect weather. Then a fog would roll in and they'd vanish. You'd hear the engines searching, then silence. Each crash was written off as pilot error. But how do you teach a man to trust what he cannot see? It was desperation that brought them to Link. The brass arrived skeptical, their uniforms immaculate, their expressions carved from disbelief. The demonstration began in silence. Link's blue pilot trainer sat in the hangar, humming faintly like a sleeping animal. A young pilot climbed in, sealed away from sight, the cockpit dark except for his glowing instruments. "Begin the flight," Link instructed, adjusting a valve. The machine hissed, tilted, and swayed as if caught in a crosswind. The pilot corrected instinctively, scanning his dials, following his compass. The plotting table beside them traced a perfect pattern of turns and climbs. When the test ended, the officers crowded the paper. "He flew blind?" one asked. Link nodded. "Completely." For a long moment no one spoke. Then another officer murmured almost grudgingly, "He flew better than most do in daylight." Something shifted. The laughter that had once followed Link's invention vanished. The impossible now seemed necessary. Within weeks, the Army Air Corps ordered 6 of the strange blue machines, each built from organ bellows, wood, and genius. It was a small order, almost experimental, but its consequences would echo across continents. For the first time, flight could be taught without risk. The sky no longer had to be a graveyard for beginners. What began as one man's obsession in a dusty workshop was about to become the salvation of a generation. The first revolution in aviation, born not in the air but on the ground. By 1939, the world had begun to shudder toward war, and in a quiet corner of Binghamton, New York, a small organ factory was roaring with life. The air smelled of sawdust, glue, and oil. The same rooms that once built pipe organs now echoed with the rasp of planes that couldn't fly. Rows of carpenters, machinists, and seamstresses worked beneath low lights, assembling shapes that looked like oversized toys. Wooden cockpits painted a dull navy blue. The Link trainer had found its heartbeat. Edwin Link walked the floor in his coveralls, sleeves rolled, eyes red from sleepless nights. He moved between benches, inspecting bellows, testing gauges, listening for the breathing rhythm only he could hear, the whisper of compressed air flowing through the machine's lungs. He had built the first one by hand. Now he was building hundreds. But expansion meant compromise, and compromise was the thing he feared most. Workers tightened bolts, cut canvas, wired rudimentary instruments scavenged from aircraft scrapyards. Each piece had to respond like the real thing. The stick firm but sensitive, the pedals weighted, the compass needle trembling with motion. Every movement of the pilot inside had to be matched by a motion outside, subtle and delayed by just enough to feel real. At one end of the factory, a line of women in kerchiefs fitted miniature altimeters into small brass housings. Their fingers moved quickly, delicately, the rhythm steady as breath. One paused to smile at a passing airman waiting to test the prototype. "Don't get lost in there," she teased. He grinned back, unaware he'd soon be practicing exactly that, getting lost on purpose. When the machines were finished, the testing began. Each blue box sat on a small motion base connected to pneumatic bellows. When air was pumped through, the cabin came alive. It tilted, swayed, and rolled like a living creature. The first time an inspector climbed in, he laughed nervously. "It feels like it's thinking," he said as the trainer leaned into an imaginary turn. But not everyone was convinced. Outside Link's circle, the skeptics still muttered. They called it a toy. A carnival ride for cadets too soft for the real thing. "You can't learn to fight a storm in a box," one officer scoffed. "War doesn't come with instructions." Link didn't argue. He only nodded, turned back to his machines, and tightened the bolts that kept them moving. He knew war would prove him right. When Britain declared war in September, the world's appetite for pilots exploded. Orders flooded in from the RAF, the U.S. Army Air Corps, and training schools across the Commonwealth. The Binghamton factory doubled its staff overnight. Convoys of crates rolled out daily, bound for fields and hangars across the globe. Each crate carried a fragment of safety disguised as wood and air. The machines began to hum day and night, a chorus of bellows and pistons breathing in rhythm, hundreds of artificial storms waiting to be unleashed. Pilots lined up to enter them, some joking, some afraid, all changed by what they found inside. Link's invention had crossed a threshold. It was no longer an eccentrics experiment. It was an army in its own right, a quiet one built not of wings or guns, but of patience and design. And as Europe's skies darkened and the first reports of downed aircraft filled the news, the world finally understood. Survival in the air would depend on what was learned on the ground. The blue box was no longer a novelty. It was becoming the front line between life and death, the revolution no one saw coming. By 1942, the world was burning, and the sky had become a battlefield. From Texas to Bengal, from England's cold airfields to the steaming jungles of Australia, a new army was taking shape, not in squadrons of fighters or bombers, but in endless rows of wooden boxes painted blue. They looked absurd, alien, small domes lined up inside hangars, each one breathing softly with the hiss of air pumps. Together they formed the quietest revolution in military history. The Link trainers had multiplied. Factories could barely keep up. Crates arrived daily at bases with stenciled markings, Link Aviation Device Type C. Mechanics unboxed them like sacred instruments, bolting them to the floors of makeshift classrooms. The walls were lined with maps, compasses, and a single plotting table, where instructors charted invisible skies. There was no glory here, no roar of engines, only discipline and repetition. Inside each trainer, a young man sat alone in near darkness. The lid closed, sealing him off from the world. His hands rested on the stick, his feet on the pedals, his heart beating loud enough to drown the machine's hiss. An instructor's voice crackled in his headset. Turn left to heading 180. Maintain altitude. Watch your instruments. For hours they flew imaginary missions. Through storms that didn't exist. Over mountains that were just lines on paper. Through the endless whiteout of simulated cloud. They learned to trust dials over instincts, rhythm over panic. Every second was a rehearsal for survival. At Randolph Field, Texas, cadets joked about it. They called the trainer the Blue Coffin. But no one laughed after their first real flight through fog, when the horizon vanished, and the lessons from the box became muscle memory. For many, it was the difference between coming home and disappearing into cloud and silence. Across the oceans, the same rhythm echoed. In Britain, Royal Air Force instructors spoke through clipped tones and static training pilots bound for Bomber Command. In India, weary men practiced navigation through monsoon storms, the machines sweating in the tropical heat. In Australia, young recruits learned night flying in hangars lit by kerosene lamps. Every hum, every movement inside those boxes was mirrored across continents. By war's midpoint, nearly every Allied pilot had passed through one. The math was staggering. Thousands of bases, tens of thousands of machines, millions of simulated flight hours. The Link trainer had become more than a tool. It was the unseen backbone of victory. Each machine carried a paradox. It was lifeless wood and metal, yet alive with the breath of those who entered it. The men inside never saw the world they flew over, yet they learned to master it. When the cadets finally climbed into real cockpits, engines roaring, clouds rising to meet them, there was fear, but not surprise. Their hands moved steady, their eyes fixed on the gauges, their training whispering in their bones. They had already been here before, in darkness, in silence in a box that never left the ground. The sky over Normandy was chaos. Engines screamed through cloud banks so thick that even daylight seemed to drown in gray. Radio chatter tangled with static and fear. Somewhere above the coast, a formation of C-47s struggled to stay level as flak burst in black blossoms around them. The pilots couldn't see the horizon, couldn't see each other. Only their instruments glowing faintly in the dark. Yet their voices over the radio were calm. They had done this before. Not here, not now, but in a wooden box that had taught them to trust the unseen. Across the war's endless theaters, from Burma's jungle storms to the vast blue emptiness of the Pacific, the same pattern repeated. The men who had learned in Link's trainer moved differently. When the clouds closed in or night swallowed the earth, they didn't fight panic. They followed procedure. They believed the dials. They remembered the rhythm. In one bomber squadron over Germany, Lieutenant David Harcourt later recalled how the instrument training had saved him. "We flew through a thunderfront so rough the plane nearly tore apart," he said. "I couldn't see the wings, couldn't see the stars. Just black. The others were yelling on the radio. But the gauges, they were steady. I just flew the needles. When we broke through, we were the only ones still level." That same calm spread across the war. In the Pacific, naval aviators practiced carrier approaches in total darkness, guided by radar operators trained the same way, inside Link's humming blue boxes. In Burma, pilots navigated torrential rain and mountain fog by memory, their training written into muscle. It was like the machine had been a storm before the storm, one said. When the real thing came, it felt familiar. Allied command began noticing the pattern. Pilots who had trained by instruments survived 3 times longer than those who hadn't. Entire units credited the Link method with saving them from the confusion that killed so many others. Flight schools expanded the curriculum, making instrument simulation mandatory for every new recruit. The little box from Binghamton had proven itself not just a tool, but doctrine, and yet even perfection in practice couldn't stop the war's toll. Planes still vanished. Men still failed to return. Some of the most skilled pilots, calm in fog and fearless in training, fell to fire or chance. Their absence hung like static across the airwaves, a reminder that even mastery couldn't defeat mortality. After the war, survivors often spoke of the blue box with reverence. They remembered its smell of varnish, the hiss of its bellows, the voice of the instructor in their ear. It wasn't just a machine. It was the place where fear was rehearsed until it became confidence. In every cockpit where calm hands steadied trembling wings, Edwin Link's invention was there, invisible, mechanical, immortal. It had not just saved lives. It had taught men how to survive the sky. It was a machine that breathed. Inside its wooden shell, leather bellows expanded and collapsed with a rhythm like lungs drawing air. Every hiss, every pulse of pressure translated motion into meaning. The Link trainer wasn't magic. It was mechanics elevated to art. What looked like a blue toy was, in truth, one of the most complex analog computers ever built. At its core sat a simple truth. Flight could be simulated if you could imitate the sky's resistance. Link had realized this decades before anyone spoke of algorithms. Beneath the pilot's seat, a network of pumps and valves converted control stick movement into motion. Pull back and the bellows filled, tilting the cabin nose high. Bank left and one side compressed while the other exhaled. The cockpit rolled smoothly, weighted by air. The system's brilliance lay not in electronics but in the purity of its physics. Air pressure in, gravity out. The trainer's base was a spider's web of linkages. Metal rods connected to gyroscopes, gyros to dials, dials to a plotting board in the instructor's station. Every twitch of the pilot's hand was drawn as a thin ink line on a moving map. To the instructor, it looked like calligraphy written in real time, a signature of skill or failure. The precision was uncanny. No electricity guided it, only vacuum and balance. Inside the cockpit, the illusion was total. The controls moved like a real aircraft's, stiff in turbulence, smooth in level flight. The artificial horizon dipped, the compass spun, and the altimeter climbed in response to invisible air. Even the turn coordinator lagged just enough to feel real. The entire system ran on the same principle as a church organ. Wind through pipes tuned to motion instead of sound. The son of a piano builder had, in essence, composed a mechanical symphony that taught men to fly. Link's genius wasn't just in replication, but in intuition. He knew that real training demanded imperfection, slight delays, unpredictable responses, the chaos of motion. The trainer didn't move perfectly. It moved believably. That difference made it indispensable. Pilots learned not to control the machine, but to trust it. To trust that instruments told truth even when instinct screamed otherwise. For those who opened the trainer's base, it looked like madness. gears interlocked in ways that defied simplicity, valves hissing in rhythm, a heartbeat of air. Yet every piece had a purpose. Altitude, yaw, pitch, and roll, all encoded in metal and motion long before computers gave those forces digital form. What Link built in that factory in Binghamton wasn't a simulator. It was an analog soul, one that turned physics into faith. Before software, there were springs. Before algorithms, there were levers. And before artificial intelligence promised to think like us, one man's machine taught us to feel the sky, with nothing more than wood, wind, and willpower. By 1944, the Link trainer was everywhere, from the deserts of Arizona to the frozen hangars of Iceland. It had become as essential to the Allied war effort as fuel or ammunition. Yet the man who built it, Edwin Link, was vanishing from his own creation. The machine had outgrown its maker, swallowed by the machinery of bureaucracy. The Army called it government property. Engineers in Washington claimed they had refined it, improved it, standardized it. Link's patents were cited in footnotes, not headlines. Procurement officers bargained his prices down to near loss, treating his invention like any other piece of equipment. Replaceable, impersonal, nameless. "It's not art," one officer reportedly said. "It's hardware." Link didn't argue publicly, but his letters from the time tell another story. "They want the machine," he wrote to Marion, "but not the mind that built it." He'd fought skepticism for a decade. Now he fought success itself. Factories bearing his name churned out simulators by the thousands, stamped with serial numbers but not his signature. The irony was brutal. A device that taught recognition, trust, and precision was now erasing the man who had imagined it. Still, Link refused bitterness. He poured his energy into evolution. He designed a celestial navigation trainer for bomber crews, a submarine simulator for sonar operators, and even an early diving chamber for undersea research. Wherever there was danger that needed to be rehearsed, Link saw a solution. His genius was never content with applause, and it lived in iteration, and yet history's pen was already drifting away. To generals, the trainer was an asset. To industry, a contract. To historians, a footnote. The same system that had needed his defiance now absorbed it, translated it into doctrine. The bureaucracy had learned to simulate genius just as he had simulated flight. As victory neared, Link's machines were hailed as training miracles, but his name was spoken less and less. The man who made simulation real was being replaced by his own invention, a ghost in a world he'd taught to move without him. After the war, when the orders stopped and the hangars emptied, silence finally reclaimed his blue boxes. The world moved on, forgetting the lungs that had once taught it to breathe. By the 1950s, the sky had changed its sound. The low growl of piston engines gave way to the shriek of jets, and with them came a new kind of speed, one that left the past gasping in its wake. Technology had sprinted ahead, and the old blue boxes couldn't keep pace. Pneumatic bellows, once revolutionary, now looked quaint beside flashing radar screens and early computers. The Link trainers, thousands of them, were rolled into hangars and storage yards across the world. Rows upon rows of wooden shells sat gathering dust, their paint flaking, their once living breath stilled. The air that had once hissed and surged through their veins was gone. Mechanics who had once tuned them like instruments now walked past without a glance. The machines that had made pilots out of boys were suddenly obsolete. Some were sold for scrap, their brass dials stripped for parts, their canvas skins burned. Others were donated to schools or museums, where children climbed inside and laughed, unaware that they were sitting in the cockpit that had taught men how not to die. Progress had no patience for sentiment. The pilots, though, remembered. Decades later, they would speak of the trainer in tones usually reserved for old comrades. "It was like flying in a dream," one recalled, "and somehow that dream kept you alive." Another said, When the clouds closed in over France, it was the sound of that machine, the hiss, the hum that kept me steady. Their memories were sharper than any official history, carried not in books but in reflex. In the hangars where the few remaining trainers lay forgotten, time became their final instructor. Dust settled where hands once rested on throttles. Cobwebs draped over compasses that had guided invisible flights. A faint smell of oil and leather lingered like the ghost of motion. Progress moved on without looking back, and the Link trainer slipped quietly from the story it had written. But the paradox remained. The machine that had saved lives, that had birthed the very idea of simulation, was itself left without preservation, the first casualty of the future it created. Still in the corners of aviation's memory, its echo endured. The small blue box that once taught 1,000,000 men how to fly without falling. The modern flight simulator hums with quiet light. Digital screens wrap around the cockpit. Algorithms spin data into motion, and pilots in crisp uniforms glide through storms that never existed. Outside, the sky is calm, yet here inside these machines, chaos can be summoned with the press of a key. Failures can be rehearsed without tragedy. Mistakes can be learned from, not paid for. It is a world built on safety through imagination, a philosophy born not in silicon, but in wood and air. Every modern simulator, for pilots, surgeons, astronauts, and soldiers, traces its lineage back to one man's stubborn faith. Edwin Link, the organ maker's son, built the first world humanity could risk without consequence. Long before computers, he gave us the courage to fail safely. From the lunar module's training pods to NASA's zero-gravity chambers, from military drone controls to virtual reality cockpits, the architecture remains the same. Model the real. Make it safe. Repeat until perfect. Link never lived to see how deeply his idea would shape the modern world, but its fingerprints are everywhere. When astronauts learned to land on the moon, they did it first inside simulators. When surgeons practiced delicate operations on artificial organs, they are following his method. When a commercial pilot trains for engine failure in a calm, controlled room, that is Link's legacy breathing through circuits instead of bellows. The machines have changed, but the principle has not. Rehearse reality until it cannot kill you. It is the bridge between human fallibility and mastery. Link's blue box turned chaos into pattern, fear into procedure, and in doing so, taught an entire generation that discipline could outthink death. Yet beyond the engineering and doctrine lies something more human. Every great innovation begins as an act of faith against the known. Link's idea was ridiculed, dismissed, nearly forgotten, but he built it anyway, because somewhere between art and science he believed learning should never require loss. The machine that trained men for war had, at its heart, a philosophy of peace. Today, one of those original blue boxes sits in quiet preservation at a museum in New York. Dust gathers on its wings. Light filters through the windows, touching its cracked paint, its silent dials. Visitors walk past, some curious, most unaware. But if you stand close enough, you can almost hear it breathe again. The soft hiss of air, the pulse of persistence. It waits there, still teaching, still whispering the lesson it gave the world. That courage need not be reckless, that failure can be rehearsed, and that imagination, not machinery, is the truest form of flight. In the end, Edwin Link didn't just build a simulator. He built a future, one that still runs quietly wherever humans learn to master the impossible before facing it.